And I think the fact comes down to this, that remember, God, he's outside of time, and he's dealing with, what about all these people who lived before Jesus? Are they just gone? Are they dead? Well, we know that they're not, because we have like places like Hebrews chapter 11, which talks about the Old Testament saints, those who came before us in the faith, and they believed, right? They had faith. Essentially what it comes down to is this: they had faith, and they received grace, the grace of God through faith, and they received it by trusting in something that God was going to do one day. And they trusted based on the amount of knowledge that they had.
All right. Hey, well, welcome to this episode of Sermon Extra. We are here with Nick, Cady. I'm Stephen Pomeroy. We're at Whitefields Community Church in Longmont, Colorado. And today we've got some questions that we're going to ask in reference to the sermon series that we're going through, Behold Your King. We're in Matthew chapter 9. And so we're just going to draw some questions out of the passage and questions that have been asked to us, to Nick, after this last sermon, and just kind of go over some of those questions. But before we get started, we just want to encourage you, whatever method you're listening to this podcast on or watching this video, we encourage you to like it, subscribe to that so that you get the next episode, you get a notification of when that comes up, and that way you can just get every episode of the Sermon Extras and just be tuned in. And so we appreciate you for doing that. So yeah, let's get started. All right. So first question is, Jesus forgives, he heals and forgives a man that is paralyzed. And the question is, Jesus forgave him, but he hadn't died yet and he hadn't risen. And so how does that work as far as forgiveness, providing forgiveness apart from the sacrifice that Jesus ultimately would do on the cross?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll tell you why it's also a good question. Sometimes people would ask, why did Jesus have to die? If he can just do what he did here, which is just pronounce forgiveness of sins, then why didn't he just do that? Why not just save himself the trouble of dying on the cross and just pronounce everybody forgiven who he wanted to forgive? Or say, hey, if you believe, you get forgiven. And I think the answer comes down to the fact that Jesus did indeed have to die in order for sins to be forgiven. And that gets to an interesting thing here. But let me wrap this up, then I'll get to that, which I didn't bring up on Sunday, but I think it's worth mentioning. And that's getting back to this point. Could Jesus just pronounce forgiveness of sins? Or was this guy actually forgiven? How does that work? Here's what it comes down to. Like, if you look back in the Old Testament, a verse that's quoted 3 times in the New Testament is that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. And yet there's also, like, how is that possible if Abraham lived before Jesus had, come and fulfilled all righteousness on our behalf to give us that imputation as a gift, right? Just as our sins are then imputed to Jesus. So before that transaction, if you want to call it that, took place, how was it that Abraham was declared righteous? And I think the fact comes down to this, that remember, God, he's outside of time, and he's dealing with, what about all these people who lived before Jesus? Are they just gone? Are they dead? Well, we know that they're not, because we have like places like Hebrews chapter 11, which talks about the Old Testament saints, those who came before us in the faith, and they believed, right? They had faith. Essentially what it comes down to is this: they had faith, and they received grace, the grace of God through faith, and they received it by trusting in something that God was going to do one day. And they trusted based on the amount of knowledge that they had. It's kind of like Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, right? In past times, God spoke in many times, in many ways, through the prophets. And in these last days, he's spoken to us through his Son. So we now have the fuller picture, and it's more clear. And so what are we trusting? Well, we trust that God now has done something. In other words, we're looking at the same event from 2 different perspectives. And so this man was trusting that what Jesus said was true. His sins would be forgiven. He didn't know how that was going to take place or when or what exactly would need to take place in order for that to happen. But he received that word by faith. He had confidence in Jesus. That was my definition of faith that I used this week. I think you can have multiple definitions of faith. I've had multiple over the years, but this was mine for this week. I think it's the one that comes out of this section. Confidence in Jesus. Jesus says you're going to be forgiven. You have confidence that that's true. You may not know exactly how, but that's okay. And so how does that work? Well, it's credited to you as righteousness. If you really want to get into details on this, here's my big thought on how this takes place. I'm not alone in this. It's a very common belief, but a lot of people who haven't, I think, really dug into it, maybe they wondered and they haven't sorted it all out. But here's basically kind of what it all comes down to. In Luke chapter 16, we have this. It's not really a parable. It's a story about a rich man and a poor man named Lazarus. The rich man doesn't have a name. Lazarus, the poor man, is given a name or told his name. That's also very significant. I mean, the fact that you would say, oh, this rich man, he had a name in this world. And yet, because of his lack of faith and trust in God and surrendering his life to God, in the world to come, his name isn't even mentioned. Whereas a nameless person who begs on the street, God knows his name and calls his name for eternity. That's significant. But the bigger part of the story is this. They both die. Lazarus goes to Abraham's bosom, and the rich man goes to Hades or hell. And here's what that means. That in the Old Testament concept, there's this idea of Sheol. Sheol is the dwelling place of the deceased as they wait for the reconciliation of all things, right? So what that means, it's, if you will, to use a very crass way to put it, it's like a holding tank. It's a waiting room. But this waiting room, if you will, is divided into two parts. And it says that between these two parts, there is an unbreachable chasm. You can't pass between them. The one side is called Abraham's bosom. That it says there in Luke 16 is a place of comfort as they await the reconciliation, meaning that what Jesus would do on the cross to reconcile us to God. And then the other part, hell and Hades, the place of torment, which is the man just asks, please send someone to dip their finger in water and touch my tongue, right? It's a place of torment while they await the final judgment. And so what happened then is that we know that when Jesus died, he's, in the tomb for 3 days, 3 nights. What did he do during that time? Well, the creeds, like the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, they tell us, Apostles' Creed specifically says, he descended into the depths. Now, sometimes in English, that has been translated as he descended into hell. That's actually been revised in the English translation. The Greek text of it never changed. It's just that descending into hell means something different than descending into the depths. And so actually the official English translation of this has been revised to say it should not say he descended into hell. But again, the text of the Apostles' Creed hasn't changed, just our English translation of it. And it says he descended into the depths. And what that means is that he went to Sheol. And what did he do? Well, it says in Ephesians chapter 4 that when he descended, he led captives in his train and ascended and gave gifts to men is the next part. Well, that has to do with Pentecost, which we just celebrated, by the way, this past Sunday. But that's a different story. The part about leading captives in his train has to do with the fact that what did Jesus do when he descended into the depths? We also know from 2 Peter that it says that he preached to those who were captive, but he didn't preach the gospel so that they could believe and be saved. Remember, that chasm's unbreachable. It says that he essentially went to those who rebelled in the time of Noah and the like, and essentially declared what had happened, right? That this, what Noah told you was true. God has provided salvation, and now it has come to completion. And so that waiting room that's in 2 parts, half of it, Abraham's bosom, he then takes those people, releases them from that holding area, and takes them to what we could call the immediate presence of God, which is why in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 it says that, and chapter 6, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So if you were to die today, let's put it this way, in faith in Jesus, you would not go to Abraham's bosom. That's been kind of closed shop on Abraham's bosom. You would go directly to the presence of God, and you would receive a new body. Okay, so that's that. Now, if you were to die apart from faith in Jesus, where would you go? You would go to the remaining half of that waiting area called Hades or hell. But understand that is still not your final destination, because it says in the book of Revelation that after the final judgment, it says that hell and Hades will be cast into the lake of fire along with Satan and his demons. Long story to explain what happened to people who believed before Jesus died on the cross. The answer is they went to Abraham's bosom. But now that the reconciliation has taken place, now you would go to the immediate presence of God. Long answer to a simple question, but yeah.
No, I like how you tied in Abraham, and he was justified by faith, and it was counted to him for righteousness. And even in the chapter, Romans chapter 4, where it really goes through that whole process and the justification by faith, there is that part towards the end of the chapter where it says Abraham basically believed that he who promised was also able to do what he said.
Yeah.
And that's that confidence that you're
Totally.
talking about, and that faith that saves, confidence.
And then here's the other thing I said that I didn't say on Sunday, but I was thinking about. Okay, you know how he says that Jesus asked this question, which is easier to say? Your sins are forgiven, or get up and walk? Now, I said on Sunday, I just said, look, the easier one to say is your sins are forgiven, because forgiveness is an invisible transaction. You can't see whether or not it has taken place. But if somebody says, rise up and walk, either you do or you don't. It's visible. Now, this isn't the question Jesus asked, but I think it's worth mentioning. Which is easier to do? So in other words, which one's easier to accomplish? I would say it's easier for God to heal someone's body than to accomplish forgiveness of sins. And if you just think about this, like in the creation, God speaks a word and it happens. But in order to forgive sins, incarnation, he becomes a human being, right? He lives a perfect life. He dies a sacrificial death. He rises from the grave. He ascends into heaven. There's a lot more involved. Pain, suffering, sacrifice, all that. So, okay.
Yeah. All right. So this next one's going to switch gears a little bit, and this is kind of a heavy question, but what about violent criminals? So we're talking about forgiveness, and so what about the violent criminal that has committed a crime that we would look at and say this is absolutely horrendous? How could God forgive that? Where's the justice in all of this? So talk about that and how God extends forgiveness and who qualifies and how that works.
I like this phrase I heard once. Somebody said, the entirety of the Old Testament is a building tension that asks this question: who will God turn out to be in the end? A God of justice or a God of mercy? Because if you read some passages, it seems that God is just very merciful. He says, you've sinned, but it's okay, I'm going to save you. And then in other passages, he says, even if you've sinned just a little bit, like the most minor infraction, you deserve judgment, and the wages of sin is death, and there is no sweeping it under the rug. There's no way to weasel out of it, right? Like, this is it. And so which is it? Who will God turn out to be in the end? A God of justice or a God of mercy? And the answer to that question is not given until we meet Jesus. Now, it's certainly pointed to and alluded to, and some hints are given, and maybe even some very direct hints, like in Isaiah 53. But the answer to that question doesn't become really clear until we meet Jesus, and we see that God became one of us, and he took the judgment for all sins upon himself. And that is why we can receive mercy. In other words, every sin that's ever been committed will be paid, or let's put it this way, it has been paid for. And another thing I like to point out is that sin is all different kinds of sin. All sin is equal quantitatively, meaning a sin is a sin is a sin. A big sin is a sin, and a little sin is also a sin. But sins are different qualitatively, right? Like committing rape has much more lasting effects and detrimental effects than, speeding infraction that injures no one, right? So I think that's important to point out. I guess you could put it like, you think about like throwing a rock into a pond, right? You throw a big rock, it has bigger ripples, it has waves and things like that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that this is sometimes hard to wrap our minds around, but this is the mystery and the wonder of forgiveness, right? That it's not something that we deserve. And therefore, it's not about, you could say, is it fair? Well, in one sense, yes. In another sense, no, right? It's fair because the price was paid. It wasn't like he just said, never mind. In another sense, in our reception, is it fair that my sins are forgiven? In one sense, kind of like, no, I didn't deserve that, right? It's God's grace. And so, yeah, I think the only other thing I would add is that, like, if you look at Romans chapter 1, what he describes there is how there's this kind of like devolution that takes place, right? You become more and more debased as you turn away from the Lord. And so oftentimes I think about these like really heinous sins that take place. I think, man, that is someone who is so far given over to evil that it would be that they're quite far from turning to the Lord. And yet salvation is a miracle of God, even like the inner transformation that takes place. So it's not just like, well, that guy seems far off. Well, Paul the Apostle was murdering people, and he was not looking for Jesus. And Jesus went and looked for him, found him, knocked him off his horse, made him blind. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, God does that. So,
yeah, it's a miracle.
Yeah.
So, all right. So let's talk about how Jesus refers to himself in this passage. So he pronounces forgiveness, he heals the man, and then, he pronounces forgiveness, and then he says, so that you may know that the Son of Man has power to forgive, and then he says, rise up and walk. So this term, Son of Man, you've talked about it 2 weeks in a row now, and so talk a little bit more about it, bring some clarity to that, but then also contrast that with the fact that Ezekiel, he says it 93 times. Ezekiel refers to himself as the Son of Man. So what's the difference? Obviously it can't quite mean the same thing, so what's going on there?
Yeah, it's not that confusing, but I hope I make it clear that like the term Son of Man, whenever it's used in the Bible, it doesn't always mean that it's talking about the Messiah. So Ezekiel's referring to himself as a son of man, or we might say like a son of Adam. And, Adam means man in Hebrew. So it's a son of Adam, son of man. It means that he's a person, right? It's a way. But here's another thing. And this is another layer of complexity you might add, is to say that when Jesus uses this term son of man, which is primarily in the Old Testament used by Ezekiel, it might be used in the Psalms. I'd have to like look into it, but it's primarily used by Ezekiel. That's a fact. So when Jesus says that he is the Son of Man, he's in a sense, on one hand, saying, I am the messianic figure described by Daniel. And if you read that passage, Daniel 13 and 14, it's super clear, like what is happening there. This is the Messiah. It's one who is given the authority of God, and he reigns over an everlasting kingdom, which is the exact language that's been used throughout the Old Testament to describe the Messiah ever since 2 Samuel 7. And so he's saying that's who he is. And what's important about the Son of Man passage there in Daniel is that the Son of Man doesn't just reign over an eternal kingdom, but he sits on the throne of God. I mean, like, he's bringing in a new aspect, like to show something that Isaiah talks about. Isaiah calls him God, the Messiah. But Daniel's like, yeah, he's God. He sits on the throne of God, right? Okay, so, but when Jesus used that term, it's like a dog whistle, if you will, for the Jewish people. They remember the passage, but they also remember, who else used that term? It was that prophet, Ezekiel. So Jesus is associating himself by using that term as a prophet, and as a term which is used by one of their greatest prophets. So Jesus is putting himself in that same kind of speaking mode, And he is referring to this passage in Daniel, which tells us a lot about Jesus, right? So not only is he a Messiah, he is a prophet, right? Which is one of the passages about the Messiah from Deuteronomy 18. The Messiah will be the prophet greater than Moses.
Yeah. I love how, I mean, Matthew is geared written towards the Jewish audience, and how Jesus uses phrases to trigger that recall back to Old Testament passages. Even, on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? So that's Psalm 22, and that should recall the whole Psalm, put it all in context, just like that Daniel passage. It's, it's one, little phrase that triggers the rest of that. So, and chapters and verses weren't, a thing back then. So, you had to kind of, reference a key phrase, and then that would trigger the rest. So I love that. All right. So anything else that you feel like, man, I wish I could have crammed that into the sermon, and I'd like to share it now?
Oh, nothing else that really comes to my mind. I mean, I got to share with it. I think the idea, Jesus, friend of sinners, is so powerful. I'll tell you one thing. In between services, as I was about to go preach the second service, I just had this overwhelming feeling of like, I don't want to say sadness, but almost like I was almost a little bit sad. And here's why, because I thought to myself, I am never going to get to preach this message ever again. And I like this message because I like the way I started it with that quote. It's an old thing from like a church that we found, but I love that thing. This church opens wide her arms with a welcome from Jesus, the friend of sinners. And then like as I was preaching on this text, I was like, oh, this is sad. I'm never going to get to preach this message again. And I hadn't even preached it for the second time yet. But man, I really liked this message.
Wow. Yeah. It was good. It's powerful. Yeah. So, all right. Well, hey, we appreciate you joining us today on the Sermon Extra. As you noticed, we asked an actual question that somebody wrote in or talked about and asked us directly after the sermon, after they heard the sermon. So if that ever happens to you, you hear a sermon, you're curious about, it triggers a question that comes to mind, then feel free to ask, leave it in the comments. We'll address the questions and, try to help you grow in your walk with the Lord. And as you come to understand the Bible more fully, as we try to take it, verse by verse and just build the scriptures building upon itself, and I think there's a quote that I love, that the best commentary on the Bible is the Bible. So we're here to help you learn. So ask those questions. Remember to like the video, like the podcast, and we'll see you next time on Sermon Extra.